Millions join a worldwide march. The battle between President Trump and the media rages on. And Utah's legislature convenes and immediately tackles controversial issues. Tonight on the Hinckley Report, women march throughout the world, including thousands in Utah. What was the focus of these demonstrations? What is the impact? The new administration spars with the media.
This kind of dishonesty in the media, the challenging that bringing about our nation together is making it more difficult. There's been a lot of talk in the media about the responsibility to hold Donald Trump accountable. And I'm here to tell you that it goes two ways. We're going to hold the press accountable as well.
What do voters think about Trump's alternative facts? A litany of executive orders are signed. How will they affect Utahns? And what does it mean for our economy? The legislative session opens with a long list of needs, but limited funding. And what projects will receive coveted resources? The governor gives his annual State of the State.
The height that Utah's economy now occupies is remarkable. The state of our state is truly exceptional.
And a Hinckley Tribune poll reveals Utahns' thinking on polygamy, approval ratings, and Senator Hatch's political future. Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I am Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Pat Jones, former state senator and now CEO of the Women's Leadership Institute, Michelle Price, political reporter with the Associated Press, and Quinn Monson, associate professor of political science at Brigham Young University. Glad to have you all with us today. The inauguration occurs, and the very next day, another major event in history of the United States. We have the March on Washington. Some 2 million people nationwide, 1 million in Washington, D.C., marching. And Senator Jones, let's start with you for just a moment. What was the message and the theme of those that were marching on the Capitol?
I think the message is that we're tired of bullies. And I think everyone has been bullied at some time in their life. And I think what that march did is drew a line in the sand for people, regardless of whether they're a woman or a man. And I think what it has done is, if you interviewed people, they would be there for very different reasons, a multitude of reasons. But it's like, we're tired of incivility. We want change, and we want to be understood and listened to.
Michelle, you were there at the Capitol. We had about 6,000 people at the Capitol. So loud, I understand, that it was hard to even hear inside the chambers. Tell us what the mood was there, and what the people were talking about when you interviewed them.
Generally, it was a pretty triumphant mood. I think they realized that they had packed the Capitol in a way that we've really never seen. It was hot and sweaty and crowded. It was like a rock concert. There was a lot of cheering. You could see that actually the senators on the Senate floor, you could hear it echoing in the chamber, their cheers, and they had to ask, the Senate president had to ask lawmakers to speak clearly into their microphones because they couldn't be heard. People who were there, they were there for a variety of reasons, as Senator Jones mentioned. You know, there were people who were just mostly protesting Donald Trump, but people who were there talking about air quality, abortion rights, a whole host of causes.
Do you think it had an impact on our legislature?
It's a little early to say. I think they were all very impressed by the numbers. You know, you saw Republican leadership saying that, again, acknowledging that we've never seen crowds like that up there. But it's unclear, you know, whether they're going to change any of their approaches to some of these issues based on what I think their biggest issue is they're not sure what this group stands for, because there's so many causes at play.
Is that a negative, Quinn? That there's not just one theme, that maybe it's multiple sorts of viewpoints?
Well, I was talking about this with some students the other day. When you think about a social movement, you think about it coalescing around a particular issue, and it's too early to call this particular event the beginning of a social movement, just for this very reason. There is no single issue that brings everyone together, except maybe the new president, but that's not quite good enough yet. It felt to me like a continuation of the campaign, and that is true of the president as well. He seems to be in campaign mode, and the opposition still seems to be in campaign mode, and there's a lot of issues that are under that umbrella, and I think it's still too early to figure out what it all means. But certainly it means something, and it was impressive.
Yeah, it certainly was. And when you look at the number of people who were in D.C., Salt Lake, Park City, right? We had some marches there as well. One thing you have to say is, even if there's not uniformity of one message, people are engaged,
yes,
right? That is something else. Explain why you think that's happening. And Senator, how does that keep continuing?
Well, let me go back to your previous question, which is, do you think the legislature will listen? I can remember maybe 2 occasions in my 14 years up there where you could really hear the noises out in the rotunda, I mean, really loudly. And absolutely, they listen to that. It's important that people, that the masses there, I think, just speaks volume. And it may not be specifically one event or one issue, but I think it kind of makes legislators feel like we better start at least paying attention to what's going on.
Once you mobilize like that, you almost have to.
But they have to be saying something unified for that message to get through, don't they?
Absolutely. But I think there were enough messages in there that, certainly that would
Probably
resonate with legislators.
Broad agreement on some of those issues. I mean, a lot of those folks, maybe they were holding an air quality sign, but if there's a vote that comes up on abortion rights, are they going to show up? Probably they're in that same political umbrella.
If I were a Utah elected official, federal or state, the one thing that would come through to me is that maybe I shouldn't line up behind the new president in lockstep, and I might be given a little bit of courage to speak out or be resistant a little bit, but I don't know exactly how yet, right? I would be a little unclear.
We're evolving right
but
now.
I do agree what you said about the level of engagement. The crowds were enormous, and I have seen personally, acquaintances that have become politically more engaged and more aware because of this last election and the inauguration that I see. This is particularly true in social media. People are posting and commenting and trying to get more involved in a way that is new.
With nuanced policy positions
Yes,
and knowledge
and
about
making efforts
what's
to
changing.
become more informed and write letters and make phone calls. It is kind of remarkable. I think there's a measurable thing going on here if we were to get serious about measuring it.
And I can tell you from our experience at the Women's Leadership Institute, since the election, we have had phone calls. We felt this brewing of something going on. We're getting calls from women who are now wanting to run for office. How do I do it? How do I get engaged? At levels I have not seen before. And I think it's a positive thing.
Certainly is a promising aspect.
This is to me why American politics is so cyclical. I mean, Trump and the Republicans are on top right now in Washington, but any time you lose, it energizes the opposition, and they get organized and they get angry, and so the Democrats will be back, right? It might be 2 years from now, it might be 4 years from now, it might be 8 years from now, but it's cyclical. Just like Republicans were down 8 years ago, Democrats are down now, but they'll be back,
I think
right?
this one's different.
Yeah.
I think this is
movement's different?
This is a very different environment right now, because of the specific things that the president said in his campaign about so many marginalized, and I wouldn't say women are marginalized, but he marginalized them. Yeah. He reminded many of us of bullies on the playground, pulling our ponytails as we waited in line in recess. And it just brought back so many, and just a flood of memories for so many women about being called things, physical abuse, emotional abuse. And I think what he did is galvanized that sense of anger and resentment that I have not seen ever before.
I agree. I heard stories from acquaintances that I know extremely well that I hadn't heard before during the campaign that came out because of the kind of stuff that was happening.
But the other side of the coin to keep in mind here is that a lot of that happened during the campaign, and he still won. So the group that helped carry him into office, they're still going to feel bolstered by their movement, which is how they've been phrasing it.
One final question about this issue too is, Michelle, you've been following some of the potential legislation this year on some of these issues like the wage gap, et cetera. What do you see coming forward? How reasonable and likely is it that it will be successful?
Well, the wage gap proposal you mentioned, it's really interesting because we've got a conservative Republican who's actually proposed it. He said he had this in the works already, but he saw the large numbers of women who showed up at the Capitol, and he said that kind of encouraged him to move forward with this effort. That's still a big ask for some of the Republican leadership. It's not clear if they'll be on board with that, but we're seeing that proposal. We're seeing family leave this year. We're seeing some broader measures to address sexual assault concerns, testing of rape kits, confidentiality of reports on college campuses. So. Some of those, I think, there's broad agreement on, especially rape kit testing, as long as.
For those legislators that are introducing these bills in this first week of the legislative session, you think this march helped bolster their resolve on these issues?
Oh, absolutely. They actually got up on the podium and spoke about these bills in front of these crowds, and they were very well received.
So let's talk about crowds a little more. All right. So Donald Trump has talked about this a little bit too. So the very first thing he comes out with is a little bit of a disagreement about the turnout at his inauguration. Quinn, why are we starting with things like this?
I have no earthly idea why you would do that, and in particular because there are verifiable numbers like metro ridership and other things that fly in the face of the claims that the president and his staff are making. So on that score, it seems to make no sense to me. On the other hand, as I watched it, I was reminded of the movie Up, when they point and say squirrel and and the dogs are distracted. There's a tendency, I think, from this president and his campaign to do so many outrageous things that it seems to be distracting while they while that's going on. There are executive orders being signed and things being done, and so I don't know if that's deliberate, but it seems to be effective in the sense that we're all paying attention to the inauguration crowds and fighting about it while he's signing, 6 or 8 executive orders that have real consequences.
What do you think about that, Michelle? Member of the press, right? And if he's just says there are many more people, maybe the biggest crowd ever for inauguration, or gets the wide-scale voter fraud, he brings those issues up as a member of the press. Do you have to look up when he does what Quinn just said, or what do you do?
When it comes from the mouth of the president, obviously we cover what he says, but we verify that. We try to present the facts on the other side of that, but you can't ignore what the leader of the free world is saying.
I don't know why so many of our politicians look at the press as the enemy. You will not win a battle with the press. You just won't, and it just makes no sense to me that a man that cares so much about the press is so focused on it all the time.
Well, and coming back to why we're focusing on crowd sizes, we do know that this president, that image is important to him. I think there's been some reporting on, he's concerned about what the members of his cabinet are wearing and who looks the part. So I think that it's all kind of part and parcel with image and approval there too.
Let's get to a couple of things that have happened in terms of some polling here in the state of Utah. We finished one election. We're already thinking about the next one in 2018, primarily about Senator Orrin Hatch. And there's this discussion about whether or not he will decide to run or not. And a Hinckley Tribune poll was just released this week talking about this very issue. 51% of Utahns said they approve of the job that Senator Hatch has done, but nearly 80% of those same Utahns said he should not run again. Let's start with you for just a minute, Quinn, on that. Explain the difference right there in those two things. 51% approve, nearly 80 say don't run.
Well, it's kind of striking because you don't often see that kind of disparity. Usually approval and a re-elect question would move together a little more. And in this case, I think it's a function of just how long Senator Hatch has been there, and people are okay with the job he's done, but see it as it's time to be done. And part of that is tied up in his commitment last time to make that his last term. That is that is going to be the crux of his decision and any campaign that might result should he decide to run again.
For those that are thinking about running in this particular race, Michelle, are they going to be deferential right now and wait for Senator Hatch to decide, or do you think that a poll like this is going to make people start getting motivated?
I think they're somewhat deferential. I know former Governor John Huntsman has said he'll wait to see what Senator Hatch does, but that might not rule out a run. I think they're going to be weighing that a lot against the environment where we are a year from now, how Senator Hatch has reacted to Trump's proposals, how the country's feeling about the president at that point, how much fundraising, Senator Hatch has been doing. There's a lot of factors at play there. I think there's a couple potential candidates who are already kind of banking on running no matter what. Derek Miller of the World Trade Center has already been pretty active about responding to things that the president's doing and getting out there and mixing it up in the debate.
And what should give people pause is what happened to Dan Lillenquist last time, which was he got in the race and then realized he couldn't raise any money. And so it remains to be seen if Senator Hatch can exercise the kind of influence this time that he did last time, which was to basically dry up his opponent's fundraising and make it impossible for him to actually run a robust campaign. So I wouldn't underestimate Senator Hatch at this point on that score. But, you know, it's been 6 years. Who knows where that stands? But if I were thinking about running against him, I would sure want to know if those funders are going to stick with me once I announce publicly, and if the money will be there or not. Or I'd want to have a bank account like John Huntsman that I could write checks from.
I want to get to Governor Huntsman in a second, but maybe Senator Jones for just a second about that. Senator Hatch, it's absolutely true. He's a tough campaigner, and you never count him out. And he's very good when he's campaigning. But I'm interested about this. The 78% of Utahns that think maybe it's time to pass the baton. Are they not concerned about the great influence he does have, the power of his seniority? President Pro Tem, Chair of Finance. He's had a private meeting with the President of the United States just this last week about Utah issues. Is that not an issue that is really swaying those folks?
I think it is with some. I think some people understand that there's the incumbency, and especially as his power in Washington is important. But I think if any time there was a time for change, it's this year. I mean, haven't we seen that on the national level? I just truly believe that 40 years in office, that many people feel like it's time for new blood. They want to see some new change, and I think it's just more important to them to see that kind of change and to try something new.
What do you make of this same poll, Michelle? 62 to 21 of a direct head-to-head for Huntsman at the 62% with Orrin Hatch at the 21. So, what do you make of that right now, this early on in the election?
Well, it's been a while since we've seen Governor Huntsman actually in the state campaigning, but he did leave a pretty positive memory for a lot of Utahns. I think with Hatch, I think the big issue comes back to what's he going to do going forward? How's he going to justify in the next year, maybe year and a half, why he gets another term? One of the things he's been kind of banding about as he's considering another term is he's talking about his influence in Washington, particularly on issues like trade. And so far, the president, for example, has kind of run the opposite direction. So there's a question about how much influence he'll really have in this new environment we're in.
Well, and I think the Huntsman name is golden in the state of Utah and outside of Utah. I think they also see Governor Huntsman as someone that gets along really well with people. I mean, I was in China when he was ambassador, and I was able to go in a room where he was with all of these Chinese dignitaries. And I, of course, don't speak Chinese, but I watched their body language. They loved him. And I think he just empowers that for people. They see that he is not a real partisan. And I think that's really where most people are today.
However, to get through a Republican primary, you need to be a partisan. And being ambassador to China for a Democratic president doesn't necessarily endear you to Republican primary voters. So it remains to be seen, in my mind, just how problematic some of his post-governor activities have impacted his prospects as a Republican nominee, and whether it would be better for him to run as a Republican or run as an independent. Because the numbers in your poll would play better for a general election, right? It remains to be seen what Republican primary voters would do, and what would happen once Senator Hatch and John Huntsman Jr. start throwing mud at each other, which would almost certainly be the case. If they get into a campaign, they're going to be quite critical of each other.
You're right, and this poll was of voters generally, not of those very specific delegates that will be voting at convention, which is what we'll be watching next as well.
But there are other ways to the ballot box, and I think if he chooses to do it that way, I think he would have a great chance to
It's
win.
really a primary at this point. I don't think, I mean, with the changes that have happened, they would both end up on a primary ballot.
It's not going to be like 2012.
No, we won't see a senator go down in convention, and that would be the end. We'll see a primary, for sure.
We need to get to a couple other local issues here. We had a chance to hear from the governor. He did his State of the State address this week, and some of the themes were a little different than what we hear from Republican governors sometimes. Michelle, why don't we start with you, and then to you, Senator Jones, for a comment as well. What did you hear in that you think will resonate with Utahns that might not be a typical Republican approach?
Well, one of the surprising things in the governor's speech was he seemed to endorse this proposal that just came out, or it was revealed this week that we've got a pretty high-ranking Republican working to overturn the separate preparation area requirement known as the Zion Curtain. I don't think, it's been a long time, if ever, that we've heard a governor mention alcohol in a state of the state.
Well, take a second and explain what that is, that Zion Curtain, for just a moment, for those that may not know.
So for restaurants that were built after 2009, they're required to have some kind of barrier around their bar structure, or a separate area, a back room where they actually mix and pour alcoholic drinks. The thinking is that the preparation of the drinks, can encourage children to, think alcohol is fun and attractive, and that they're going to want to consume it. The other side of that, people say it's really ineffective. People are still drinking openly in the restaurant, and it's silly. It looks weird. People argue it even hurts tourism, but.
We have heard that. Is there any significance to the fact, Quinn, that a conservative Republican is the one sponsoring legislation to remove that Zion Curtain?
Sure. Republicans control the legislature, and I don't think it would get anywhere without a Republican sponsor and without some help from the governor. And I also don't think I would be, I don't have any information to lead me to know this for sure, but I'd be surprised if any of those things were happening without at least some kind of tacit approval from the church, which has been very involved in alcohol policy for Utah for decades, right? They pay attention. That's one policy area they pay close attention to, and I don't think the legislature makes sudden movements on alcohol policy without some kind of approval from the church.
So you've been in the Senate. You know I was going to come to you for a second. Is that true?
Yes.
What do you make of the fact that this is surviving already so long?
The church doesn't get involved in that issue. They see it as a moral issue, and I have witnessed them being involved in that issue.
And Representative Wilson has said he is talking with members of the church. They're engaging on this, and I think the thinking here is that they'll try or that he would pursue this like our anti-discrimination law. Democrats had tried that for years. Once a Republican pushed it forward, he had the church on board. That's how you get these kinds of things through the Utah's legislature.
You can't get, you have a supermajority of Republicans in the legislature. Without their cooperation and help, you can't do anything. That's just the facts.
There were other Republicans when I was there who were pushing to remove the Zion Curtain, as it's called.
I mean, it's a recurring theme, which was so interesting that it's getting some traction this legislative session for sure, with some 70+ people in this percentage of the people in the state of Utah saying they're okay with that going away. So this is going to play out and be a very significant issue, I think.
I would be shocked that Governor Herbert would put it in his speech without knowing that the church was willing to at least talk about it. That would be a political mistake of huge proportions that I don't see him making, and I don't see his staff allowing to happen. So even though I don't know that that's happened, I can't imagine that you would talk about it in a State of the State speech.
Have you ever heard a governor talk about changing the alcohol laws that you can remember in the State of the State?
I can, and he did, to that point, he did mention, he said we have been talking about this issue, and with stakeholders, and that probably does include the LDS
and
Church.
I think the hospitality industry has been very involved in, under wraps, if you will, maybe more overtly.
They just hired a lobbyist.
What'll be interesting to see is what concessions are made. I mean, there's going to be some kind of a deal made, is my anticipation, and in exchange for getting rid of the Zion Curtain, maybe there'll be something else, some other ground that's given, and that'll be interesting to see.
That is absolutely true. I mean, they're already talking about grocery stores having a special license to sell beer. I mean, there's other.
And they're talking about marking up the price of alcohol. Maybe, I think it's at 85, 86%.
Yes,
maybe they'd bump
education.
it to 87, 88. Changing rules about where children can sit in restaurants. Could they sit near the area where people are drinking, or are we going to have separate walled-off drinking zones in restaurants? We'll have to see.
And I think where they're going with this is to get some increased funding for education about underage drinking and things like that, and that seems to be.
Let me get to the city level for just a moment as well. President Trump has been signing some executive orders. One of those has gone to whether or not federal funding will be flowing to so-called sanctuary cities. And our very own mayor of Salt Lake City, Jackie Biskupski, press conference yesterday said we have no intention of being the ones enforcing these federal immigration laws. Michelle, for just a moment, how significant is that? And is that really even a change of operation for the city?
Well, I think as far as we're looking at how much of an effect will this have on Salt Lake City, Jackie Biskupski is certainly not alone. There are a number of other cities. The whole state of California has kind of staked out a similar position. So whether or not she's the city's going to see some direct retribution, and see that funding yanked. It remains to be seen. But she has been pretty forceful, pushing out on this before. I think that the police chief as well has talked about not enforcing those federal immigration laws.
Senator, when you were in the legislature, issues like this dealing with the population of immigrants in the state of Utah, we have seemed to be more progressive maybe in that area in some ways and willing to let people come in to the state. How helpful is it to hear the mayor saying we're going to keep that posture as a state?
I think, seeing a culmination of many mayors doing that would be important, to have the mayors stand up with each other. But it certainly makes sense. It seems kind of weird to me that you have strong conservatives, wanting states' rights and individual rights, when in fact that's what our city's doing. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's really interesting.
It seems to me mostly symbolic, though, because I don't see any evidence that there are any cities in Utah that are enforcing immigration law, whether they are, announcing their refusal to do so or not. Nobody's got their police force out, checking ID or anything.
I think the key is if they arrest somebody and they discover they might be here without, legal documents, that whether they turn them over or not.
Do we have any evidence that anyone's doing that, though? I don't think so.
For those that have been concerned about this election and the concerns about people being deported, et cetera, are they taking more comfort today because of this in the state of Utah?
I would think, I don't know, I mean, the power of the city versus what the president could do. I mean, I don't know how much comfort they're really going to take.
I think there are some Salt Lake City residents that enjoyed that, and we're happy to see their mayor take a stand. But I don't know that I don't know that there's evidence that people are doing much. So
okay, this is one that we're going to continue to watch for Salt Lake City, but for the state of Utah, and see what impact it has on our legislature. Thank you so much. Time always goes too quickly. Thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for the Hinckley Report. For more political analysis and news of the week, check out our web extra online at kued.org/Hinckley Report. We'll see you next week. Good night.